March 19th, sorry.
Just perfect. Chairperson Cliff Olson,
Here.
Vice Chairperson Bob McCool,
Here.
Commissioners Rosita Abdul-Williams, Joanne Eaton, Phyllis Harden here, Robert Momartz.
Here.
Michelle Rittmasters.
Here.
Tom Ricker, Jim Sawtell, Assistant Town Manager Beth Winsky, Attorney Liz Cross. Here. Hunter Red Fox.
Here.
Thank you. Tonight we have discussion regarding handheld and temporary signs. Should be a riveting discussion of twirling signs,
Right.
banners, and other items. We have a full audience here ready to present to us. Fred, do you want to give us a presentation?
Let me, I'll just start here. This is a work session, so we've got like 3 different sign issues. So my suggestion is you could take them one at a time, and then you could probably craft a straw vote as to how you feel as a planning commission. And then that will be given to the board, and then at some point, it'll come back around as a full, as a code amendment, proposed code amendment, based on what you all feel, and also how the board comes down on, in the end, what they think they want to have ultimately in the changes. So does that make sense? Does that sound like a plan? Okay. Well, the first one deals, and you do have a staff report, so it deals with handheld signs, folks that are out there in the right of way or on the edge of the property line, along the traffic ways, hawking their wares, whether it be tax services or we buy gold or whatever. And along with that, I think there was also a chart about some research that the staff did regarding, how this is handled in different communities. Now, as a planning commission, we discussed this in March 20, back in March 20, 2012. And after the meeting was over, I sent a memo on that with some of the planning commission's concerns. In fact, the straw vote was 6-1 to leave the ordinance as it is. And that's actually a staff recommendation as well. Because what our ordinance does is not allow these folks to use twirl signs, in the right of way. And so, I sent a memo to Matt. Some of the things that we had discussed and agreed on was that the planning commission was provided with a memorandum from staff that summarized the town's current rules and a brief survey of some other communities in the region deal with this issue, which is the same material you have tonight. But our discussion basically came up with, I think it was 4 items. That one, there was driver distraction, which leads to accidents, and this problem has been witnessed by a PC member. I remember someone brought that up. They had seen that. Second, where to regulate and subsequent enforcement. Should all public right-of-ways be available for this use or only selected streets? This creates a level of complexity for enforcement and becomes restrictive for some businesses and not for others. Personal safety for the persons holding the sign while being in the right-of-way. And the other concern was sign holders are often wearing costumes to get attention. Does this present a positive image for the town security? And then I think the last part was that your straw vote recommended the planning commission keep the sign regulations as they are and not allow by rule or by permit process the use of a handheld sign advertising signs in the right of way. So that's where we ended up on March, what was it, 12th? 21st, I mean, or 20th, I think was the date of our meeting, yeah, the 20th. So that's the first one. And our recommendations, staff recommendations on this one are basically the same as they were before. Staff recommends that the town remain with the current code and continue to prohibit the proposed handheld signs or sign spinners and any type of movable objects attached to the signs both within the public right-of-way and on private property within the town. So that's where we're at on that one. So,
So my first question is, since we weighed in on this in March 2012, give us some background as to why it's here
Again, I think it would, I guess the question is, and I'm not quite sure I can answer that, other than the fact that it was left and not, sort of undone, and they want to, I think the board wants to make sure we still feel the same way. The planning commission still feels the same way on this particular item.
Okay. Have we had requests from businesses?
That I don't know. I don't know if Phyllis knows or not.
I do not know if there is.
Beth didn't tell me about anything like that.
Okay.
No, question. So I know during political season, there have at least been once or twice where we've, I think me included, I walked around with the sign in my hand, which according to this, we're not even allowed to do that.
Well, but we have signs in the right-of-way during election season.
Right, we're not handheld, so we're talking about handheld here.
No,
So that's illegal, right? You can't, according to this, we can't.
it's not movable. It'd be movable if you're holding.
Yeah, if you're holding that sign walking around, we're not allowed to do that under the current code, correct?
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
As I understand it, in the right of way, you're only allowed to have fixed signs
Fixed.
in the ground.
Well,
It always struck me because I saw the free expression in Arvada, and the political and non-commercial in Westminster. That's the only thing that sort of, I don't know, want to talk about.
Do we want to have some more discussion on this item? Have you come up with a straw poll on this item?
Yes.
Okay. All right, other discussion.
Prior to hearing Bob's comment, I was basically against any kind of handheld sign that moves and distracts and has people out near the roadway and that kind of thing, just based on what I see going through other communities and going through Boulder. And I just don't like the distraction and the hazard aspect. The issue you raised, okay, I guess I can talk about that one, but most of it is, I'm against it.
I would agree. I like this matrix that was put together, and I would be, it caught my eye also that in Arvada, they have free expression only as handheld signs, and, that kind of then points towards things like, if there was some sort of, and maybe there's a way to even couch it in something being organized, or as Bob has pointed out, many of us have so-called broken the law around Election Day because we'd be maybe out front here with a sign, or if there were some other kind of activity taking place where, let's say, people wanted to have a gathering about an issue, and people were going to bring their signs to, be able to inform people about that issue. In the town of Superior, it sounds like that would be illegal. We don't have any opening for that. So in light of that, I think it would be worthy of discussion and further delving into that, because we don't want to be a community that says, oh, and by the way, if something is going on and you're part of a gathering of people and you can't have signs for that.
Well, I think you can have signs, it depends on, you can have there can be a temporary sign if there's some sort of event, something like that.
It's fixed.
But in terms of.
She's talking about.
But I'm talking about
handheld
handhelds.
signs.
People are going to something and they, it could even be an event, a scheduled event at the park, and maybe it's some sort of gathering and there are people there with different booths, and if there were a reason that at a particular booth one or many people might have handheld signs and trying to inform people, that it sounds like that would be out of bounds too.
That's correct.
Okay, so I don't.
Like it's dicey when you go there.
So is that what we want? Do we want to not allow, in certain cases, individuals to be able to have that opportunity to have signs around, again, I don't know how to say it, if it has to be couched in a particular event or something, but it precludes that all across the board.
But I think it's sort of, it's sort of like what, if you feel that's a reasonable suggestion, that be allowed around particular, special events. The event probably might need a permit itself, but maybe not. It may be a tournament, ball games or whatever over at the park. And those people just show up. I mean, it's not as though it's a bazaar of some sort or anything like that. And that's what you're talking about, is that event might necessitate or have someone out in the right of way design. Yes.
I think the issue was last time about you can't say this area can have the signs, but over on McCaslin, you can't have the signs. I don't think you can differentiate that.
Right.
So wherever you have them, you have to allow them all through the town. And I think that was our biggest concern last time, is we didn't want them over here on Marshall and McCaslin.
Right.
So then, but if there's another way to do that,
Yeah. Yeah, no, you remember correct, I mean, that was the issue, that we'd have in our worst traffic area, distractions that could become then safety issues, and that's very real there.
I also, now that I think back on all the instances which I found bothersome, they were all commercial, as opposed to, let's say, expressing an opinion as an example. So I'm wondering if we can differentiate that way, since most of the quote offenders, close quote, are commercial. Or if we
I
want to do
think that's
that.
a legal thing.
Was that, find that out?
You start running into problems when you try to make distinctions based on content. So even if you're trying to make a distinction between commercial speech or political speech or religious speech, those are broader categories, and perhaps we could split those hairs, but it gets on kind of tenuous ground.
Explain
when you
a little-
start allowing and disallowing speech based on its content.
So explain Arvada's allowing handheld free expression only.
In Westminster.
Do we
In
have
Westminster.
Arvada's code provision in front of us other than?
No,
Yeah.
it's just the chart.
Not having the code provision in front of me, I don't know what they mean by quote-unquote free expression.
No,
There's a note.
There's a note.
There's a
on that.
footnote.
It looks like it could have come from the code, but.
That just talks about kind of where they
Yeah.
can be and can't be. Doesn't talk about content.
Right. On public property, a governmental entity has the authority to place reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech. That sounds like what Arvada's provision is attempting to do. But again, that gets a little tricky when you're trying to make those very fine distinctions between what you can do in this location versus that location, public property versus private property, the content of your speech.
Yeah, content, I think, is what we're questioning. Probably, I don't think there's any question about being able to do it here but not there, or.
You can certainly say you can do this or you can't do this in the public right of way, and then you can do this other activity or you can't do this other activity on private property, or make distinctions between a public right of way and a public park as being two different venues. But you can't, as you guys touched on, distinguish this intersection, this particular part of a right of way versus another intersection in the town.
Okay. So how about but you're saying the content is where it gets dicey to say, okay, if you're going to protest the war or you're going to advertise an event at the park or so on versus sale at Sears.
Say what?
Versus a sale at Sears this week, a spinning sign says there's a sale at Sears. Being commercial
Right.
versus non-commercial.
We probably could go down that road and try to say this is define what commercial speech is, and say this is where signs that are commercial speech are allowed and in this capacity. But it's up to you guys if you want us to go down that road of starting to
Okay.
piece that out.
Commissioner McCool.
And I know, I brought it up, but the likelihood of this happening in the town of Superior is fairly low now, other than a couple instances where it appears to be unenforced. I mean, walking around with political signs, or at the park or the event, you might see somebody walking around with a sign advertising, something during the event, like the 4th of July, come try our chili or whatever. So I'm not sure if it's, how much energy it's worth to.
Well, and if you open the door to one kind of commercial speech, you necessarily have to open the door to all of it. So you can't say we will allow this type of commercial speech, but then not this other type of commercial speech.
So we can't say, you can't carry around try our chili well, although you could allow commercial. You were talking about, and like I said, this could get dicey because there's probably lots of different scenarios, but you can separate an event, right? I mean, you can say during town events, commercial signage is permitted and signs are permitted within the boundaries of the event.
Right, because that's more of a time, place, and manner restriction than a content restriction.
Okay. It just depends on whether we think it's worth the energy to.
Well, and that's different too than someone standing on the right of way of the road saying, "Come to the Chili Fest," which that's a
Non-commercial.
well, it's semi-commercial. It's semi-commercial, so I think it could be kind of dicey to say.
Well, it's a town event, and the people there are not selling chili, but we do have vendors who market at the town event.
And as Fred pointed out, that kind of event that maybe you're envisioning would be something that requires a permit, or it's put on by the town in the first instance. So it's not a free-for-all public gathering where people just show up with their signs, and they would be envisioned in part of the permit, I would imagine.
The other sort of spontaneous thing that can pop up is sometimes they'll have a car wash at a church or something, and they're out there on the right of way with a sign, "Come in, we'll wash your car," and donations and whatever. I mean, that is a very infrequent thing. You can bet they probably never got a permit. But that doesn't mean something like that couldn't happen in Superior, and whether someone runs out there and from the town and tries to enforce it, is another question, which particularly if it happens on a Saturday, nothing will happen. You'll just do it and it'll be over and go on to the next day. So that could happen spontaneously anyway. But we're talking about people who represent businesses primarily that are standing out in the right of way and probably not even near the property. You're not real. In other words, if they take a step out of the right of way line, they may not even be on the property where the gold exchange is, for example.
Correct.
But they're out on a corner, which is pretty close by.
So how is let's say a park defined versus a right-of-way? My concern, and maybe it's just because I'm not understanding the terminology, but I just want to make sure that in the town of Superior, if someone wanted to have a public gathering, maybe it's a political event or something like that, it could basically be busted, based on the fact that people would bring signage for a political event, and I would see that as a real inhibition of one's political free speech in this community.
Well, I would think it would be the issue of the signs. I don't think it would be the issue of the event.
Well, but let's face it, I mean, when people go to political type things, they will often have signs.
Well, I think the point of the question maybe is that we're having discussions about where we can draw lines, right? So we're being told we can draw lines by saying public right of way or at a park or during an event or in a permitted situation, or maybe if we have you go look at it, commercial versus non-commercial. So I think the better question that Rochelle raised is if a group wanted to have an event in a public forum like a park, then we would be interested in allowing them to be able to have handheld signs in that event, which I think, again, if we decide we want to go down the road to change this code, we could say, I mean, they have to get a permit anyway if they're going to have an event in the park anyway, and the permitting process could permit them to have handheld signs during that event. Or we could even say that if you are in the park and you want to demonstrate, you're allowed to demonstrate in the park, but then I don't know if we're getting into commercial or non-commercial, and can Mattress King come over here to our park and sit in the park and hold up a Mattress King sign? I think the only boundary that's sort of in question here as to whether we can define commercial versus non-commercial. I think we can do anything else. It sounds like you used the words better, but a place,
Time, place, manner.
time, place, and manner.
And also, we have 2 nearby communities that have put apparently language together, Arvada and Westminster, along those lines, so it could be worth further looking into that. I mean, I don't want the twirlers, I don't want the commercial, handheld signs and things like that, people dressed up like clowns and all that. I just want to make sure that in our efforts to say this is what we don't want, that somehow a lot of other things get swept up with it, that's not really what was intended. That's my concern.
So it sounds like that we're kind of wanting to split this handheld sign issue into 2 pieces. I guess from my own perspective, I think I was the lone dissenter in March of 2012 when we did our other straw poll. I'm personally not opposed to sign twirlers. I find them entertaining, but that's just my own personal view. So they don't really bother me, and I was unaware that this ordinance as written would effectively prohibit anyone from holding the sign for a political event or otherwise, so that would be concerning to me as well. But from hearing the comments here, it sounds like I may be still the lone dissenter in the supporting of the handheld twirling signs, so perhaps should we confirm that with a straw poll?
Yeah, we can confirm that.
Okay. Anyone in favor of twirling signs? Okay. So I'm still out here.
Do we have enough to make a recommendation? And, but also, maybe a straw poll, are we comfortable that we might want to send the legal team off to figure out whether we can
I think you
separate
we recommend
commercial versus
that happen.
non-commercial?
You can recommend it, because this is just a couple of some recommendations we're standing on for the board to cogitate
Yeah,
a bit, and then
but we've got to send them off and spend money to have them go do that. I guess
Yeah.
I'm just asking the planning commission whether and I'm fine with that.
So are we conceptually open to like an Arvada type exception? Is that what we're headed for?
I think the first step would be to
Just see what
see
says.
exactly what Arvada and Westminster have, and if that makes sense for us, then that's where we go. Maybe it doesn't have to be much more complicated than that.
Could I suggest maybe we be a little clearer with what we maybe do and don't want, rather than, because we don't know everything that Arvada says, and they might have to go look, and then we come back and we find out, we didn't know it.
Right.
And maybe just as a recap, what I'm hearing is that we're opposed to commercial entities being able to use handheld signs in anywhere in town in any form or fashion. We are in favor of allowing non-commercial, and that would be probably nonprofits, I think nonprofits,
Civic
civic type activities be permitted to use handheld signs. We might want to still prohibit twirlers and things like that if we're really concerned about distractions on the road, if that's one of our concerns. But I think we can define that, right, twirling. But and in general, we want to allow the high school to hold up a sign if we're having a car wash, and we want to have people who are in a park and opposed or in favor of something that they want to share, that they can use handheld signs to do that. If there's an event in town, so this is maybe a little bit slightly different, but if there's an event in town that maybe within the the confines of the event or related to the event, handheld signs would be permitted even for commercial use. So if Whole Foods had a special going on over at their booth, they could walk around and say, hey, come over to our booth, you know, we're having a special on such and such kind of thing. Can't think of, does that cover all?
What about the political season?
Oh, and I'm sorry, yeah, during the political season that people can hold political signs. And I don't know that that would be limited to the political season if we allow nonprofits and civic-related activities at any time. I mean, I guess you could walk out any time and, you know, say, hey, you know, Bob's running for mayor, you know, even in the middle of the summer, remember me. But is that correct? Can you separate civic versus election?
Well, I think so. I mean, in the sense that we have election season defined in the code, and so it would be related to that during the quote-unquote election season.
And usually, I think you're onto something there in terms of election-type things are pretty clearly defined. I mean, if it's so-and-so for this or that, or county commissioner, that
But what if an amendment is coming forward to, you know, like, I mean, you know, we've already passed the marijuana law, but, you know, amendment isn't written, but there's all kind of noise about legalizing marijuana, you know, and that's a civic thing that's going to be, it's an election-related item that's going to be coming forward. Is that a civic activity if somebody wants to start walking up and down this sign saying, you know?
It would just depend on how you define election-related versus civic. So if you define election-related narrowly to include something related to a ballot question or a candidate, that's very narrow and would exclude what you're talking about as an issue that's heading towards election but
Right.
not on the ballot yet.
So that's still election-related, so you can prevent it? It's
Well, that's what I'm
civic
saying. It
or-
depends on how you define election-related, how narrowly. So if you define it specifically as related to a ballot question, the situation that you just described would not fall under that election-related category because
Right,
even
because
though
it's not an election-related
it's the same
category.
issue,
Yeah.
it's
So is it a
not-
civic thing that, so yes, you could do it because it's,
would depend on how you define
Define civic.
Yeah, it just depends on how you define these terms.
okay. Yeah.
And that's something to think about also.
Sure, okay. So anyway, does that summarize our interest?
Well, I had a question, and maybe you said it and I missed it, Bob, but is that anywhere in town?
I think that's anywhere in town with the exception of the commercial being allowed to use handheld signs during the event if they have a booth within the event, that they would be permitted within the confines of the event to have a handheld sign for.
So anybody can be out here on Marshall and McCaslin in the media? So that's just my question.
Yeah, I think that's what I said.
Okay.
I'm open,
That's-
I'm
that's-
definitely open for discussion on that if we can prevent, can we prevent certain areas?
Well, that's what I was going to
Town
follow up
or-
and get a sense from you guys. Is there distinctions that you want to draw between
Where?
the right-of-way versus private property? So that a business might be allowed to have a sign twirler on the private property of the shopping center, but not out at the intersection in the right-of-way? Like somebody walking perhaps through the parking lot or...
Before we go, can I ask you a question about, is the separation either, yes, you can do it in the right-of-way, or no, you can't do it in the right-of-way, or can you even separate, you can't do it on the right-of-way in this part of town, but you can do it in the right-of-way in this part of town? I mean, can you be that definitive, or is it,
I don't think it can be that
or that?
definitive. I think it has to be, it's
Either
in
or.
the right-of-way, it's all or nothing.
Okay, cool.
On private property, it's all or nothing
Nothing.
in terms of commercial speech.
Okay.
My own opinion of the, should we allow it on private property versus right-of-way is, to me, that becomes a real gray area to enforce. When I drive through the shopping center, I can't tell what's public versus what's private. I don't think most people know the difference in that, so I think enforcement of that would just become a real headache. And I think the overall feeling of people is, we just don't want to see sign twirlers, everyone except me, doesn't want to see sign twirlers. So whether they're in the Whole Foods parking lot versus on Marshall and McCaslin, doesn't sound like it makes a whole lot of difference.
I think you're right on that.
Correct.
On the take on that, yes.
I would agree.
And there's another aspect to that too, is that if you're on private property, like in this shopping center, you're falling under the sign guidelines of all the other signs fall under the guidelines of the shopping center. In other words, you want to have a sign permit to put an off-the-wall sign, and there's really no mention of handheld signs and all of that, like for instance in the marketplace thing at all.
So does it default to our code?
Well,
They don't have it
definitely
defined?
it would default to it unless there's something in there that says that it can't have them. So it depends, that would pop up as well. Is that defined or not defined in their guidelines? And if it's not, then we would default back to the code. But if you're on private property, you have to go back and see. In that case, in the marketplace, they would have to have some approval from the property owner, which would be the developer, wherever they're standing. So if they're standing on a Costco lot, then it'd be Costco that would have to say it's okay. Obviously, if it's their sign, they probably agree. But that might not be the case if you go over one of these shops, and that's owned by the developer, and he doesn't particularly care to have people on private property twirling signs. So there's another layer there, that's all I'm saying.
But not
Possibly another
yeah.
layer.
Yeah. Which we wouldn't really have any jurisdiction over anyway, so. yes.
Okay. We have some members of the public here. Would you anyone care to comment on twirling signs? No? Okay, just checking.
Is that enough for you to go on?
That's helpful, yes.
Okay, I think we're good at twirling signs.
Twirl
You want me
that
to
one.
read what sort of your recommendations would be then, or try to get that?
Sure.
Well, I have his recommendations here. They're generally opposed to commercial uses being allowed to use handheld signs in the right of way or on private property. Right? Okay, that's one. Second is favor the ability for non-commercial or civic activities and for events to have or use handheld signs in the right of way or on public space. Now we were thinking about the park. Is that right? Am I on target there?
Yes, I think so.
The third one is,
Can I back up just one,
Yeah.
on the park, we could separate whether that's covered under permit or just generally allowed to, correct? But I think we talked about, you just want to generally allow a person to, 2 or 3 people who don't require a permit to go up here to Founders Park, is that our park name now? And walk around with a sign. That would mean that we just allow nonprofit civic use signs in parks regardless, or we could limit it to permitted events, right? Yeah. We-
But a kid's car wash or...
That's true, that wouldn't be a permitted
Wouldn't
event,
be
so
permitted.
I'd say let's leave it open.
Right.
so that's just sort of a general.
Yeah.
Okay. Third one, let me go to I think the easier one. The third one would be that for political excellent election seasons, that handheld signs are okay. And that's both for, well, the election season to me is whether it's a referendum or whether it's a person running for office is the same. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah.
It's during the because the referendum will, like marijuana thing, it'll come up and it'll be voted on at an election. So it could be any activity that's being voted on during election season or like candidates. So you can hold a sign for Amendment 64 as well as hold a sign for Joe Dole.
Correct.
Okay. And then the other one, the fourth one is commercial events may allowed to have, and this is a little sketchier here. Commercial events be allowed to have If they have an
Well-
event, if they're
Yeah,
having.
not commercial events,
They're
but
civic.
town.
Civic events.
Civic
that-
events
Can
where there's a
we
commercial.
clarify that, maybe permitted events, town or permitted events,
That would be, yeah, permitted events,
or town events?
town.
So if Whole Foods wanted to have a,
I'm just wondering, do we really need that? I mean, is it that big of an issue? I mean, if you're at the Chili Fest and you see a Whole Foods sign, is it really, does that need to be defined? I just wonder if we.
I would agree, I don't think any of these are going to be enforced if they have
I just
anyway,
don't,
but.
Well,
yeah, A, is it going to be enforced? B, are we going to be bombarded with sign people knocking us over?
No.
So I just wonder if that's even, I just wonder if we even need to go down that road. I see the issue, but just others.
I just want to make sure that, let's say there's a permitted event that's political in nature, doesn't have to do with the election, doesn't have to do with a candidate, but something that's going on, that gathering, that people can hold signs.
That's a civic thing. I think Clint was specifically talking about, do we need to define the ability for commercial.
Commercial within the civic event.
Within a town event, within an event.
Okay.
And I guess my only point to that would be that we're doing this anyway, so do you just define it so it's done and we don't have to worry about it? But I don't care.
Yeah.
I kind of agree with you.
so it'll be something like civic
bit of
events
minutia.
that require either a permit or approval from the town. I mean, in other words, some sort of approval, let's say by some rec group to use the park for some reason. Usually they come to the town and say, we want to kind of like take over the park for a half a day or something, and there's some sort of approval or there's some sort of discussion about that with Parks Department or whatever, and then it's okay. So any civic events requiring a permit or town approval can have handheld signs.
Okay.
Okay.
But are we restricting that to participants in the event versus?
Or can you? Yeah. Well, you're right.
That's the
You're right.
thing.
Can
I mean, I saw
Someone's
the.
going to jump in there and take that over.
Well, no, can you walk around and advertise can you go to the Chili
Yeah.
Fest and walk around with a sign?
And that happened in the
advertise?
election season,
Sure,
where
yeah.
someone put up a commercial sign because it was now allowed in
Right.
the right of way.
Yeah.
I see the point of wanting to have this in writing so that somebody doesn't say, well, you're not allowed to have commercial stuff on signs, but I almost think you open the door to putting this in writing, then can you restrict Ford and Chevy and everybody else from having a bunch of sign people wandering around?
I mean, do we feel like we need to? I mean, do we care? I mean, do we care if a new store is opening and the Chili Fest is on, they come in and they walk around with a sign or whatever,
Sandwich board.
sandwich board over their shoulders to advertise their store? I don't think I'd have a problem with that. I think it'd be awesome. I know you don't because you're open to twirling signs everywhere.
Maybe
So
they're handing out samples too, so, I'm all for it.
I think any signs inside of an event are fine. I think it'd be a great way for people to be able to advertise to the community.
Well, and I think that's why this is before us. I think that's why it's back before us, is because someone wants running signs.
Well, they still won't get that. They won't get that.
So the way that the sign code is written now, under the signs that are prohibited, there are certain categories that are catching these handheld signs, these twirlers. Perhaps a way to go about it better than working under the restrictions of a prohibition is to get rid of that language to generally allow handheld signs, but then start carving out limitations. So think about the kinds of signs as you are that you don't want. The commercial twirlers, perhaps on the right-of-way, seems to be a big one. Rather than trying to articulate what you want to allow, think about what you want to prohibit, and then we get rid of this general prohibition of sign twirlers and start with, okay, these things are generally allowed, these handheld signs, these twirlers are generally allowed, and then we start carving out limitations on what we don't want.
So that's a very good point, and so my question would be, if someone wanted to stand there and hold up come to Sears grand opening, or come to the store's grand opening, is that,
That's commercial, though.
I know it's commercial, but is it as offensive as the twirler guy? Because the point being that that's what someone is wanting to promote their business that's tucked back in, just the same as a politician who's standing there with a static sign. To me, I just don't see the difference.
Private property or right of way?
All of the above, anywhere.
Well, I think the opposition you got was, no, we didn't want that.
Do we not want the twirling, the costumes, the twirling?
No, I don't
versus-
want even the static one in the typical right-of-way. Again,
But what-
with
but what- but-
with the safety concerns and this being the heavy traffic and the heavy commercial, and if we open up the door to commercial handheld signs and the distraction and dangerous condition that's there already, I think we've already said that commercial is not where we want to take the handheld sign language. And the handheld sign language, we're trying to just make sure that it's staying open for the civic and political purposes.
But what we're saying is that someone can, on that same corner, can stand out there and say, I oppose the war, I want you to vote for this person, smile, be happy. There's no limit to what people can
That's a good point.
And I may say, again, and this is why we ask, well, is there a way we can somehow parse out what's right-of-way and what's not? Or is it right-of-way in terms of these strip-type areas versus, a park and a place where you're not going to be creating a distraction to key heavy traffic or something?
You can definitely draw a distinction and put certain restrictions on right-of-way, roadway, versus other public properties such as a park.
Okay.
You can treat the two differently.
But continuing with Clint's thought, then that means you can stand in Town 9 and walk up and down the park along Sycamore, doing your advertising and distracting drivers on Sycamore. I mean, you're going to want to do that because that's where, if you're going to advertise,
Commercial? But are you talking
Yeah.
commercial? I'm saying commercial's off the table.
Well, Clint, it's not. That's his question.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
you're saying commercial's off the table. Clint is saying, well, what's different?
My question is, what is different between a static, same size as the political signs, someone's standing there and says, come to my grand opening, versus vote for Joe? To me, there's no difference in
Distractions.
in level of distraction. One's commercial in nature, one's not. The note 1 for Arvada has some language about you shall not stand in traffic lane and shall not be 5 feet, shall not impede public passing by and shall not block vision. I mean, I like language like that. I think that gets to what I think that's getting to your concern. So maybe the question for the board is: Do we still want to disallow commercial, period, end of story, or do we perhaps look at it differently if it's static signs versus twirling costumes, craziness?
I'm thinking about it. I'm
Okay.
kind of getting there with you. I mean,
Flashing on different signs in different locations at the present time.
Yeah, I mean, truly, if the concern is we don't want people to be distracted by signs in the right-of-way, then you just can't permit signs in the right-of-way.
Then we leave the ordinance.
Then
as
you
it
leave,
is.
then you don't permit signs in the road. Well, you leave the ordinance the way it is with regards to signs in the right-of-way. There are other places that there's interest in having signs within parks and at events and some other things, but
Which I don't think anybody would care about whether, or whether or not it was even in writing. And I think the reason this is coming to us is because people want to be in the right of way of doing things, and that's why this is coming.
Or do we just allow signs but not in the right of way? Period. I mean, private property, permit, I mean, none,
That's
I don't know
that's
whether we want
another
twirlers or not, that's probably just a,
Semantic.
well, it's also whether we want to have costume-based or twirling-type signage in town, just as to how it represents what Superior looks like, and, I mean, we can't restrict that portion of it, the twirling part and the costume-based.
People pay good money for a good twirl.
There are some good ones out there. Did you work your way through college that way?
I wish.
No, there are some good twirlers out there, there's no doubt. Kind of warming up to that, just keeping them out of the right of way. Just let signs be signs.
If you sit here
and-
long enough, you'll
I'll be having twirling signs on.
In front of your house.
In the middle of a lane on Nottway.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the objections we had, at least that I had from day one, was around safety and distraction in especially heavily trafficked areas, and I realize it's hard to then define the right-of-way that's in heavily trafficked areas versus others, but I'd rather err on the side of making sure it doesn't happen anywhere, if that's the language that has to happen in order for it not to happen there. I just then, as we've gotten into this discussion, just want to make sure that the commercial signs and things like that are distinguished and distinguishable from the permitted times that people can have handheld signs and in public spaces that maybe are not defined as right-of-way, because that's what I'm struggling with. What is really this definition of right-of-way? Is a park a right-of-way? I don't know.
No, roadway.
Okay. So it's specifically around roadways.
Right, it depends on where the exact right-of-way line is drawn, but
Is a sidewalk in the
it
right of
generally
way?
includes the sidewalk.
Okay,
Yeah, generally.
generally. So I would say if we'll revamp this and just so we don't, the intent here is not to create driver distraction. So,
See, I guess with driver distraction, plenty of parking lot accidents can happen in the parking lot. So is it less distracting that?
yes, if you're driving 45 miles an hour down the Caslin Boulevard, or 55, even though the speed limit's 40 versus 5 miles an hour in a parking lot, yeah,
Coming
I'm
around
a lot
these
less
turns
concerned.
and watching
The
lights.
collision is going to be less severe, but there's still the potential for
Sure.
for distractions. I don't know. There's just, to me, there's a lot of distractions on every.
I just can't imagine people standing on the median, on the Caslin, on that bridge, with signs, in a strip that's this wide.
We have two of them every single
We don't.
day in Louisville.
We don't.
That's
Louisville
right.
does. That's not our jurisdiction. We don't. And I don't think that's safe. So,
And I
I think you're right.
Right away versus median, I think we can restrict
Well, the median's in the right-of-way.
medians. Okay. But I don't think I've ever seen a sign twirler for commercial business in a median.
I don't think you're going to get a twirler out of this. You're good. You're pushing the sign thing. I don't know if you're going to get twirling. You keep trying, but.
Well, I've never seen a sign person, period, in the
Yeah.
median. I've
See
seen
them on
the
corners.
side.
So we're still talking that you can have a sign that's in the ground. So it doesn't matter if somebody's walking around with them or not. You can still have it in the right-of-way for 48 hours
Oh, yeah, we're
for
not
a
talking about,
non-movable sign.
yeah. we're not-
During
I'm-
election season, though, right?
No.
Or, no, anytime?
Anytime
That's-
for
that's our
48 hours.
second-
Election season is.
Yeah, temporary.
That's our
That's
next-
the-
okay.
Right.
That's the
That's our next
temporary
item.
That's our
sign.
next item.
But our
But
point
you
is the
still
sign
have
is-
point
a
is-
sign that you
okay.
can put in anywhere in the right-of-way that you want,
Okay.
rather than somebody carrying it around and moving
Right.
around.
Well, yeah, it's the
I'm all for
directions
just
to the
leaving it as it is and
community,
say, they put the sign in there,
garage
they
sale.
don't have to have
Stuff like
you
that.
walking around and distracting drivers and all
No,
of
the
that.
whole- the whole
So
point.
I'm not in favor of that.
Okay.
But I still like the idea of civic gatherings, though, and still being able to have signs at civic gatherings and in parks, and, I mean,
I think the point of having a person holding the sign versus a stick is that it's going to get a lot more attention
Right.
to it, and that's why people are doing it.
that's the distraction. I mean,
That's the
there you go.
distraction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They want to distract you to
Correct.
get them to see what they're promoting.
Yeah. I mean, I'm leaning towards allowing commercial and private, and, and I guess we'd have to, if we do that, you could allow it, I don't know if you allow it in parks. I mean, I know we could allow it in events.
Well, earlier we said yes to commercial during
During events.
During events.
Yeah. But I just meant in general, allowing commercial anywhere, but in the right of way, that opens up a lot of doors too. But I also don't know what's going to happen because it doesn't get any attention. I mean, Mattress King's not going to send a guy to walk around Purple Park with the sign because nobody's going to see it. On the other hand, if there's an event there or there are a bunch of people there, do you want to allow that? I mean, the HOA's having movie night, in the park, so then is that a good time for commercial signs to be held? And,
Seems like the only guy that would have a sign would be the guy who's got the concession stand. It
right.
comes on-
Yeah, exactly. Or whatever, but yeah, whatever. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of crazy minutia in this. I
think
I get it.
I think what businesses really want is the most bang for their buck, and I think what they're really interested in is having someone out on the right of way where there's a lot of cars going by.
Right.
I think it's these smaller events. It's just not going to be worth their time and money to do it. And maybe a few of them there would be, but is that really worthy of a lot of regulation? And I think what we're really being asked to weigh in on is do we want to allow people out on the right of way?
So
For
can we just-
commercial handheld signage.
Can we just keep everything what we told Fred earlier, but just go ahead and clarify that not in the right of, just not permitted in the right of way? Because like you said, the commercial isn't going to care about anywhere else anyway, so why try to define that they can have it elsewhere? I mean, just leave our recommendation as we made it to Fred, but add the piece that says no signs in the right of way. Because of distraction, because of our concern of distracting drivers.
No handheld signs in the driveway or?
Correct, no handheld signs in the right of way.
For
Anybody.
anybody.
I think that's,
But see, that goes back, that's contrary to the whole political sign thing.
not really. I mean, it is, but, well, it's not contrary to it. I mean, you're still allowed to have political, well, you're right, because we stand out here in the right of way with those political signs. Yeah, you're exactly
Breaking
right.
the law.
But I think that's the point. I mean, we've got to stand for that point. If that's our concern, then I don't think it matters. I mean,
It's one of those things that probably nobody's going to complain about the people that stand out there generally on election day.
Right, it's on
And that's
election
just-
day. Woo,
Yeah, go vote, which everybody's already voted because of
There's
this.
sort of an expectation on election day that certain things are going to happen that are
Exactly.
abnormal, quote unquote, and so we tolerate it because it's an election and that's done with, and then it's no longer a concern.
until you get a complaint.
Right. And maybe that's how we ought to
Some problem with
approach it
those.
from the standpoint of, this is a broad brushstroke, this is a general rule, and then if something comes up down the road, we'll deal with it at that time, as opposed to trying to anticipate every conceivable permutation of what might occur now.
So it sounds like we're kind of going back from our earlier path of maybe going down the allowing signs and then carving out the things we don't want. So now it's sounding more like we don't want them.
Well, I think we're allowing signs not in the right of way and not, well, let's see, not,
As the code's written now, it prohibits handheld signs and twirlers and spinners in the right-of-way, on private property, everywhere.
Period.
These are prohibited signs, right? So that's where we're starting from. So if you still want to prohibit these kinds of signs in the right-of-way and on private property, then we leave everything as is.
Well, I think we're saying we do want to allow signs in parks and in.
Okay, then that's where we look at,
But for non-commercial, if that's reasonable for us to be able to, that's something you'd have to figure out, whether it's reasonable to separate commercial and non-commercial.
okay. And then
Then-
maybe another way to kind of cabin that is do a similar sort of election season provision for handheld signs. The same way that there's an election season provision that allows additional temporary signs in the right-of-way.
That's why I went with the permitted events, because if somebody's going to organize and have an event in a park to support some cause, then just by nature of that permit, they would have the right to have handheld signs, inside the park, inside the, whatever the permit covers, the area for which the permit covers. And then that covers all of that covers everything. And we could probably even do commercial and non-commercial. I mean, Whole Foods wanted to have a hamburger thing in the park.
Through the permit process.
Through the permit process, right.
I think that might
That was
simplify it.
Permitted
my-
approved event or whatever they call it.
My only concern with that is I just think we're addressing something that is not really being asked to be addressed.
Yeah. Well, no, but we've asked. We're being told here that nobody's asking. So you're making a presumption that somebody's asking because it's in front of us, but we're being told by staff that nobody's asking. So I don't know how we can, assume that that's why this has come up.
Unless there's
But-
other language somewhere, again, this language is around rights of, the right-of-way, and however that is defined, and I just wanted to make sure that, and I don't know if it's even captured in language, and maybe it doesn't need to be captured in language anywhere, that in these other public places, be it the park, maybe what may become some civic square in town center eventually or whatever, that if there's some sort of event, political, civic, whatever, that people could have signs. And maybe we're talking apples and oranges, tonight. I didn't mean to divert things. I was just trying to understand the definition of right-of-way, and does that extend to those other kinds of public places? And you're saying it does not. And so then maybe, all that's just off the table, and we just go back to saying we don't want twirlers and rights-of-way, and move on.
Twirlers or handheld signs?
Yeah, and they go one in.
Well, they don't, but.
Yeah, right, but the handheld signs, twirlers, whatever, in the right-of-way.
We thoroughly confused you.
Yeah, I probably took
So they're
them
not
down a
allowed now.
rabbit
You
hole.
don't want to allow them in the right-of-way going
Right.
forward, so we leave it as is.
Right. And then but was there an exception for political signs during election season?
Not for handheld. Oh, I think
We've discussed that people do it generally on election day.
but it's equally as distracting, and we shouldn't allow it. But what about the permitted? I mean, do we just let that go and not worry about it, or do you want to allow organized events in parks to be able to carry signs? And, I don't know that they will if they can't advertise them to the 5,000 cars an hour that are going down McCaslin, but
That's just it. I think, nobody's really going to complain about it if it is going on Try My New Sandwich at the sandwich shop across the way in Town Center. I don't think anybody's going to complain about that if it's something that's going on within a town event. But
So we're going to allow them on private property? So can Whole Foods, can Whole Foods do it in their parking lot, for people who are coming in and hold up a sign that says they're having their hamburger outing? So
that is a question that's been put before us, but
I'm just
I
having,
think it goes back to the distraction issue. Is that less distraction? Is private property less distracting than right of way? And
I think, so it lowers the risk. I mean, really, we're talking about risk here, right? I mean, that's kind of where we're at. So how much risk are we willing to take with the code we put out there? So I think by doing it on private property, that significantly lowers the risk. It's not to say that Superior Liquor can't stand 5 feet back off the sidewalk, or Breaks Plus in their parking lot and stand up there with a sign.
That's just it.
So-
I mean, Marshall and McCaslin, so somebody stands on the monument sign on the private property.
They have to have private properties, I mean, well, I guess they don't have to. We might not be able to do anything about it, but like Fred was saying, not anybody's going to go stand on somebody else's private property and hold up handheld signs.
But the monument, I mean, I just think that if we open the door to private property, we might as well do right away, because I think the whole idea is to get to places like Marshall and McCaslin. There's a monument sign, there's plenty of private property that's within 20, 30 feet of that roadway, and they'll figure out a way to dance their way to your attention.
Not allowed to dance and twirl. I'm open to leaving it as it is. Yeah. We can go full circle and
I
just
think,
leave it.
yeah, we have, but it's still the simpler solution. And we can deal with, if something comes up down the road. I mean, I'm not trying to defer it, but at the same time to try to conceive of every situation and say something on point. I think,
Are we allowed to have the permitting process requested if they want? I mean, without changing our language?
The way the
there?
code's written right now, it's an enforcement issue in some ways. So the way the code's written now, it prohibits, the language would allow the town to prohibit handheld signs throughout the town. That includes right-of-way, public property, anywhere. Right, sorry, private property. So if the big issue, which is commercial signs, twirlers in the right-of-way, distracting drivers, the code as written right now allows the town to prohibit that.
Allows them to permit it?
Prohibit it.
Prohibit it, yeah,
Right.
right, correct.
So while it also is much broader and allows the prohibition of other types of handheld signs in other contexts, in some ways right now it's an enforcement issue. So the code, it can be used as a tool to prohibit the commercial signs that you don't like, but you don't necessarily have to use it you don't necessarily have to enforce it. And I'm walking a fine line here because I don't want to say enforce it against one group but not enforce it against another. But as it's written, the status quo gives those options, or at least gives you the option of prohibiting the type of activity that you want to prohibit.
Does the permitting process for events allow you to, would something have to change to allow a permitting process?
It gets a little tricky when you insert into the permitting process decisions about, okay, this group in this activity can have these kinds of signs that say these kinds of things in this situation.
Gotcha.
Because then you could have one group who received a permit for one activity or event that was allowed to do something with signs being compared to another group that was granted a permit for a similar activity that was not allowed to do certain things. And then you run into some difficulties there.
Okay. I'm back to leave it as is then. I hate to say it an hour later. But
It was a good discussion.
it was.
well, we took a run at it.
Okay.
So fundamentally, we're suggesting maybe...
Where are you at, Rochelle? I mean, you were concerned about,
So the main concern tonight is the commercial speech, the commercial, the businesses out in the street being a distraction, or in the parking lot being a distraction.
Well,
The code as is allows you to
Any
prohibit that.
handheld signs would be
Right.
a distraction.
if distraction's the concern, then it shouldn't matter.
It's
That shouldn't matter.
That seems to be where the discussion's gone. Is that we went from no twirlers because it's a distraction to, well, maybe we want to allow political people because we want to allow free expression, but then we kind of circle back to they're all a distraction, and that's why the code's the way it is.
Right.
I think the distraction on the roadway is one thing. The signs in a park event, I think they're really kind of two different things. And I don't see,
I
don't
would,
see people responding to either event the same way.
I mean, I was just getting confused because we were kind of commingling a lot of things here, and I just wanted to make sure that in this commingling, that we weren't throwing other things into it without that explicit discussion around, parks and civic events and even political events or whatever. Set aside in a park, not a right-of-way. Not, so, and when you look at the matrix, it's kind of like, well, it starts, is it mixing private and rights-of-way, and, and it's a good matrix, and it was good research, but then as I would get into it, it's like, well, now I'm really confused, so.
Yeah, I think staff was really honing in on the right-of-way question.
On right-of-way, okay. And I think I stay in agreement with Bob and where I've originally stood, that right-of-way is distraction, safety issue, and so I don't want it.
Okay.
So you okay with leaving it as is, no signs, period,
Yeah.
anywhere?
It's the handhelds, yeah.
Right, no handheld signs. Okay.
Okay, is that our final answer? Is that our final answer? Next item.
Next item is temporary signs. And this, the Planning Commission discussed on December 4th, 2012, in regarding election signs and the time periods that you can have election signs stuck in the ground in the right of way. The original ordinance, the ordinance was, I think, 30 days in advance of the election and then a couple days after. The Planning Commission recommended 45 days, change it. And now here you're changing the definition in the definition section, because that's where these timelines are. The Planning Commission recommended 45 days, give a little bit more time. Okay. Then it went to the board. The ordinance that was passed, basically what they did, they said the election season means the time period that begins 15 days prior to the mailing of ballots for an election, or 30 days prior to an election, whichever is earlier. And then it ends 2 days after any election, and for purposes of this definition, the election includes any regular or special town election, county election, state or federal primary, or general election. So that's what the board did. So they basically lengthened the time also, and they went out and inserted the language about the mail ballots. That was the concern, is that people couldn't put up a sign 30 days in advance, but mail ballots have been already out for a month or something, and most of the people had already voted. So their whole sign campaign, from that perspective, or candidate's perspective, was sort of worthless. Throwing good
So they said 15 days prior to, how's that?
It says, yeah, the time period that begins 15 days prior to mailing of a ballot. So a candidate would come in, find out when Phyllis is mailing ballots, and then they had 15 days in advance of that, and then they could pump the sign down out here along the right of way of the cat. So that's the new ordinance. That's the way that was resolved. All right. So what we're talking about tonight is dealing with temporary signs. Is, do we want to change the time period for general temporary signs? You can get a temporary sign permit. And right now, you have, I think the ordinance is 48 hours. You can have a temporary sign up for this is not necessarily all in the right of way. This is a temporary sign, I believe, on private property. You have been put it up for more than 48 hours in 87-day period.
It says right,
This
No, I
is
mean
just
in the right of
specifically
way.
right
In the
of way.
it's right away, yeah. Okay. You require, now you mentioned permit when you were saying that. That doesn't require a permit though, right?
No.
No. Is there something,
No.
is there something different with a permit or no?
No.
Okay.
And let's see. temporary sign section is the section that deals with temporary signs in the public right.
So as I understand it, the question is simply, right now, the code allows anyone to put up a temporary sign in the right-of-way for no more than a 48-hour period in a 7-day period. So the question is, do you want to increase the duration of that time for more than a 48-hour period in a 7-day period?
And staff's.
And staff's recommendation, I believe, is something on the order of leaving the time period the same or get rid of the general temporary signs in the right-of-way altogether. However, election signs are exempted.
I kind of like the 48 hours. I mean, the reason it's useful is over a weekend, and we don't get a ton of them. I think we had this discussion before. It's not like there's 60 signs that show up on the right of way every weekend. Occasionally you see the football program or the that's trying to draw people in, for a period of time. But
But it can be, it doesn't have to be weekend.
no, I understand. But that's most likely when we're going to see it, because that's
I mean, I
that's when you see
support
the
it.
most traffic through here. But
I'd actually like to see it increased by 24-hour period. Things like when we have the community-wide garage sales, or if someone's putting up a sign regarding an open house coming up or whatever, I find 48 hours to be pretty restrictive. I don't see any reason why not to have 72.
I wouldn't have a problem with that.
That's just mine.
Staff's recommendation is to keep it the same.
Or remove it
Or
entirely.
remove it altogether.
Okay. Anybody for remove it altogether? I think especially since we're prohibiting tours, we need something.
Yeah, right, exactly. We're here to support you, Clint.
What if it's a battery-operated twirling
Yeah.
device?
Probably not allowed.
You can't have that on there.
No
You can't have
balloons,
streamers and
streamers,
streamers and
Moving
No
things.
moving attachments of
Yeah.
any sort.
No, to me, 48 hours, 72 hours doesn't make any difference. I think that's, so I would not be in favor of removing it.
Yeah.
Either would I.
I'm open to 72 hours for the reasons that Rochelle mentioned. I mean, that gives you a little bit more time going into a weekend for
Yeah, it's
a
like,
garage sale
wow.
or an open house
Yeah.
or our community-wide garage, although the community-wide
I
garage
don't have a
sales.
problem with that either.
Yeah.
Okay.
72 hours.
Okay.
More reasonable. Well, that's even.
All right, got through that one.
I'll still make it to PetSmart.
So
Gotta get cat food.
So sure we got.
I also would be interested to see why the public is here listening to this discussion.
They might just be listening.
Is this like a government in action
Yeah,
project or
great
something?
for a civics class or something.
Well, it could be, good. That'd be good. Anyway, the next one is banners, dealing with banners. And we have a section in the code dealing with banners. Item 16-2010. I think it's 4. I think that's right. I think it's 4 or 5. It's item G in 16-20-10. And here, let me get my notes here. What's going on here is, I think, the idea is to change the period, extend the time period for banners. All right? And the idea was, right now, I believe banners, first of all, if you have a banner, right now you have to get a permit, okay? No more than 4 banner permits shall be issued to a single applicant in 1 calendar year. And the banners shall not exceed 50 square feet. Banners shall not display for more than 30 consecutive days. And they're to be attached to the building at all times. And there's been a request then to extend that time to, I'm not sure.
I made the request,
Just
so
to
I can.
extend the time. And what staff came up with is that the time allowed for a temporary banner is extended from 30 days for up to 90 days with the following considerations. One temporary banner permitted for display for 90 consecutive days permitted in 1 year. So that's that's 3 months, the banner's up, done. 2 temporary banners permitted for display for 60 days each over the course of 1 year. So if you've got a business, you can put up 2 different banners, one time each.
So you get 120 days if you do it that way.
Right. Or you can have the same banner for 60 days.
If you do that in 2 different
Yeah, you can do it in 2 different time frames. As well as the current code allowance, which is 4 temporary banners permitted for display for 30 days each in 1 year, not to exceed any of those maximums. So we sort of came up with that. There was a request made to extend the life of the time that banners can be up. So that's where that was coming from. So staff considered that, and thought that was maybe a reasonable way to accommodate that request, but that's.
Okay. So the request was from,
I made it on behalf of Monarch Little League. I don't know if this accommodates it, though, so that's what I want to talk about. But I can explain what the deal is. So what Monarch Little League is able to do in Louisville in the ball field is they have sponsorships that are sold, and part of the sponsorship deal is that a banner is put up on the back fence at the ball field for the sponsor, for a gold sponsor. I think so. It's, there's a handful of them, could be 5 or 6 or 7 gold sponsors, and they get a banner hung up out on the back fence of the ball field during the Little League season, which 90 days covered.
This would like each sponsor would have a banner, would be a
Yeah,
banner
so-
with the sponsors on it, or it could be a combination of that?
The way it is in Louisville is each sponsor has a banner.
Okay, so everybody can read it and all that, okay.
Correct. Actually, I think in addition, there's one big banner that they put in front that has them all. But yeah, the main thing is that there's a, I think they have an overall sponsor that gets a bigger banner somewhere else. But same thing. So reading this, I wasn't sure whether that allowed for that, but that was what the request was, so that in addition to doing it in the Louisville ball fields, can they do it in the Superior ball fields and have the gold sponsors banners on the back fence of the ball field where they play ball. That's the request.
I would have thought that,
Now, this would apply, any changes would apply to anybody asking for a banner.
Correct.
in
So
my,
that means the commercial as well as the guys that want to do it at the ball field, or
Right.
the league, or whatever.
And
Because
I
it
would have
required a
thought-
permit.
I would have thought those were 2 different things. I mean, to me, a business building banner, to me, is totally different than something at the ball field.
I agree with the same view that you're expressing.
And I don't,
Well, we have time, place, and manner at our disposal.
Right, because, yeah.
But if you're going to allow commercial it's a commercial sponsorship of a nonprofit organization.
Right.
So I'm not sure where the lines get drawn there, but
where are we
They're
talking about?
crossed.
we're talking about the back fences of probably the 2 ball fields that are in Community Park. That's where they play.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there
So what
currently,
I mean, I would think the Parks Department would regulate all of that. I mean, that to me doesn't seem like a sign code.
Well, so right now, the way that the sign code is set up is it distinguishes between residential property and non-residential property. Banners are allowed on non-residential property
Okay.
under the terms that Fred just explained. So you have to apply for a permit. You're allowed to apply for up to 4 permits within a single calendar year. Each permit allows you to display your banner for up to 30 days. So the question is, do we extend that 30 days to 90 days, or do we come up with some other alternative that allows a banner to be displayed potentially longer, maybe not 90 days in, one consecutive.
But does that even address this particular request? Because there could be there could be 5 gold sponsors that have banners that Monarch Little League wants to put up
Well,
on the back fence.
each banner would be subject to its own permit.
So they would not, this wouldn't accommodate them if they had,
And if the duration of that permit were extended from 30 to 90 days.
but they can only do 4. Right?
Only one 90-day. Only one 90-day.
Right, they might have 5 gold sponsors. So this doesn't accommodate that request, but, because they could have, I think we have at least 4.
So then you're talking about suggestions to change the number of permits allowed in a calendar year to more than 4, or do away with that altogether?
Is it possible to pull out things for parks from the sign code and just make this a decision or policy or whatever of the Parks Department? Because I can see the need or the desire to do longer advertising, and this kind of goes back to does anyone really care? And I don't really think that people do care. What I'm reading in this matrix is that we've already got the most generous banner code in the county, according to this matrix. So I don't think, especially knowing that we're not getting a request from business to do this, and I think we're kind of addressing the wrong thing here by addressing the banner, or addressing the code through this request.
Well, I think that's how we regulate, I mean, I think that is how we regulate our signage, so.
Well, that's the question. Can this be done or can it not be done? I mean, can banners in the parks be
Different.
Can they be different than commercial and
Banners on the building.
residential?
No, I don't think so. Under the code, they would be treated the same.
No, we were,
Right now, but if we potentially changed the code.
yeah, you could change, you were telling me we have time, place, and manner at our disposal to use here. So place would be something we define as a place, and we have parks defined as a place. But we couldn't restrict Whole Foods, for example, from wanting to put up a banner on the back fence of the ball field if we allow.
I believe that you could carve out parks under this banner provision and place different requirements on, or different allowances on what kinds of banners can be put up in parks and the requirements that are attached to them, and not affect other kinds.
I think that's the simplest way to handle this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So perhaps some guidance on what those allowances or requirements in parks would look like would be helpful.
And I don't, my personal opinion is I don't think we necessarily need to define that. I think that's, we've got a Parks and Open Space Commission, we've got Parks and Open Space Department, and ball clubs that have needs, and I think those are the individuals that need to be defining how long banners and sponsors should be promoted and things like that. I don't know that.
Well, as the sign code's written now, signs like that on a ball field are prohibited.
Well, I think what he's suggesting is he doesn't care about any restrictions, but, I mean, so I think we have to have code.
Yes.
And regarding this.
Right.
And we're saying that we're okay with separating it out in a park.
Yes.
And that has to be any park, right? It can't just be community park, or can it specifically be community park?
It'd have to be any park.
It would have to be any park, right? So it's any park, Purple Park included,
Right.
potentially hanging from the pavilion in the middle, right? We just need to be careful here. So, I mean,
That's getting really ugly.
yeah, I mean, it doesn't happen. you
Had some
know, but-
images that I didn't
Yeah.
particularly care for. I can see it on
I guess what
sports
we're going
clubs
Yeah,
and
but
sports
in the
good
context,
activities.
in
and-
the context of sponsorship.
When you said manner, I might want to understand what manner means. We have time, place, and manner. Oh, how, that's how, right?
The size of the sign.
I guess I'd like to see, you've got residential, you've got commercial, and then you've got parks.
Yeah.
And then, before we define what goes in parks, the parks piece That's what I'm saying.
Let them.
There's people more,
Right, I
there's
got
people
you.
more invested in this than us
So then
to
we're-
define. And then those people can say, okay, banners are appropriate on fences behind baseball fields. They're not appropriate in Purple Park,
Right.
on the lake, and things like
Right.
that.
I quite agree with that.
Can we write that kind of stuff in?
Right, but perhaps the first step would be making a recommendation for public input on what,
I'm just saying that we should, our first step, should we choose to make it, is to carve out parks as a third entity, I guess if you were, third property type
Right.
beyond residential and commercial as it's currently defined. We have a.
And we can do that. We've been told that
Yes.
we can do that
Yes.
at this point. But we're going, you're even maybe going a step farther and saying fences on.
I don't want to go a step further.
Okay.
I want other people to go a step further.
Right.
I'd like to kind of set up the.
Then you're setting up, you're starting to put us at risk. If I understand our conversation before, you can't say that, we can't allow the Parks Department to decide it's okay for Monarch Little League to put up 4 signs on the back fence, but, tomorrow say that Whole Foods can't put up a banner on Purple Park
Sure.
because,
Sure you can. I mean, you can
Really?
say the park department regulates signs. I mean, could you not?
Can we?
I mean, Could the code say signs are regulated by the Parks Department?
I mean, if Whole Foods wants to sponsor the Little League, if it's in the context of the.
I'm not talking about, I'm talking about fairness across,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just talking general fairness.
Okay.
But from what I heard, it's,
so perhaps there could be
I
an
like the
ordinance that
idea.
sets up a similar banner permit process specifically for signs in public parks. And then you figure out what that permit process looks like. And, for example, you won't be able to say that Whole Foods is allowed to have a sign, but this other business isn't. It needs to be much more general than that. But you can at least set up a different, separate permit process for public parks, and then get
Yes.
input on what that might look like before we even try to draft code language.
I just don't think that we need to me, it seems like we be putting way too much into code as opposed to putting the guidelines in to let people make these decisions and perhaps change them if things are not working, because that's what we have a Parks Department
Yeah, I mean,
for.
you're
Yes.
suggesting the Board of Trustees look at an administrative methods.
Yes.
For which to deal with this, particularly in the parks.
Yes.
In lieu of running new code language for this
Yes.
particular situation.
and is that something we can do? I mean, is that-
Well, I think, I'm kind of putting it off because that would give, I think, everybody a chance to figure that out. Right?
If you want to treat parks differently, you're going to need some kind of language in the code. It could be very general and simple. It wouldn't have to be, a whole nother sign code as elaborate as the one you have that applies to parks. But it just simply distinguishes if you want to get a banner permit in a public park or another type of sign permit in a public park, here's how you do it.
Yes.
And it could be exactly the same kind of process, maybe slightly different time, place, and manner restrictions in the sense of maybe you're not limited to 4 permits, or maybe they're not limited to periods of 30 days, but there's a kind of a parallel, similar process simply applicable to signs in public parks versus signs on other kinds of non-residential property.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because they're two different things. They're two different things, and they're for different purposes. I mean, when you've got a Little League event, you've got a Little League season, and you want promotion during that Little League season. When you've got a business promoting a grand opening or a sale, it's a totally different thing.
Yep.
And I think they should be handled separately. So I don't think I wouldn't have even thought that they were regulated by the same code. I would have thought that they've been regulated by parks all
It's just that the sign code is written very generally in some senses, and so it only makes some big distinctions, such as residential property versus non-residential property. So non-residential naturally catches commercial property, parks,
property.
right-of-way, those kinds of places. And there are some specific provisions for certain issues that are already in the code, as we've touched on, like, you know, the spinners in the right-of-way, but there are other issues, like signs in public parks, that haven't maybe come up or had a need to be addressed specifically in the code.
So can we make a general recommendation on this to, the recommendation being that we separate out parks for the purpose of how banners are going to be displayed, and that, this is a piece I'm not sure how, but Fred used the word administrative, and that, you know, to help me if we can or can't do this, but that, like Clint had mentioned, that the Parks Department has some control through the permitting process over where signs can be placed, you know, in a reasonable fashion, because you're right, you don't want a banner hanging from a
Right.
pavilion in Purple Park, or even for that matter, necessarily a, you know, a general structure in any of our parks. So, but allow the Parks Department to control that. And, I mean, if we have to put in, you know, I agree. My preference would be that we don't even put it 90 days or 30 days or 20 days, because for Little League, it happens to be a season, which happens to fit into 90 days. But if, you know, if Mustang football wants to do the same thing and their season's longer, then I mean, they opt, or soccer or somebody else, and they're doing the same thing, and we wouldn't allow this, then it needs to be, you know, managed on a, you know, season by season. I mean,
And that's going to change, you know, things change
And that's
over
gonna change a lot,
time,
right.
and time frames change over time, and that I think we just set up the structure so Parks Department can make these decisions, and
but I think we want to say that we would be, either we are or we are not, in favor of allowing banners for sponsorship purposes in parks for our sports teams. I mean, that's what our intent is, you know, otherwise,
And let them
you go back to the
consider
Parks
it.
Department and somebody's decided, well, I just don't like it, so this year we're not gonna allow banners at all, and that would go against the intent of the town's planning commission or board, as the ultimate case may be. So having some direction for them to be able to follow this administratively in the spirit of what the board ultimately decides they want, I think is important.
Right, so while the genesis of this discussion comes from sponsorship banners in public parks, the ultimate ordinance or permitting process cannot be limited that narrowly. It would have to
Sure,
be
understood.
banners, period. But there could be restrictions in that permit process for
Well, you have commercial and non-commercial,
criteria,
which
right.
you said you could go down that road and look at it and see
Right.
if we could define it. That might be a way to separate, you know, so that not it. But again, I don't know if we care.
And all of this is sports oriented, right? So.
Well, this request is, that's what we're talking about.
Well,
Yeah, so the first step is
within the
just-
context of what we're talking about, so all sports as opposed to any park. It's all a sports facility, a field of some sort, right?
It is, yeah. That's not
So
definition.
it sounds like the general recommendation is to look at how we treat signs, including banners in parks differently. For example, sponsorship banners on a baseball field,
Right.
and similar types of signs. And then we go from there.
Or maybe we don't use the broader term parks, and we use the more narrow term, you know, the organized sports fields. And then, because that's where this really is heading toward, because what I'm hearing is, well, those concerns for, well, it would pop up in Purple Park and pop up here and there. So if the intent of this is around being able to enable the sponsorship.
Non-commercial.
Right, non-commercial, and having it part of the sponsorship, having it being, you know, supporting sports, civic organ, you know, that kind of civic activity, you know, then maybe we come up with the language that even so much goes so far as to talk about that specifically for sports fields, here are the guidelines. And it will be, you know, administered through Parks and Rec.
And I would say narrow it as best that we legally can.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you say nonprofit sports fields, then that means any nonprofit could request banners on a sports field, whether it has anything to do with
Right, so we'll,
particular,
yeah,
but
language will be finessed, but I think we know where.
I think we can say what we think we're interested in getting to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Right.
and that we support that.
Yeah.
We support that kind of,
distinction.
yeah.
Is that a reasonable request of staff to?
Yes, and then we can get into the
The-
nitty gritty of,
yeah.
well, you can do this, you can't actually do this, it has to be this general, it can be this.
And Louisville
specific.
does it somehow, so it might be worth looking at
Yeah.
Because if you break it,
how they're doing it.
if you break it that way, then you don't get stuck with a finite number of days. You could just say baseball season, and it
Yeah,
sort of
the
defines
sponsorship,
itself.
the
and-
sponsorship covers that.
You can
Yeah.
use it back, define things. in
I think
way.
that accommodates everybody much better, because, I mean, sports, they have, some of them have multiple seasons, they may have multiple sponsorships, they may have, you know, I mean, there's a variety of things that could,
If there's playoffs, the season may get lengthened or
Could be.
shortened, or, you know.
Okay, good.
Special tournaments.
Yeah. I think there's just inherent flexibility that way.
Anything else on that?
No, I think we covered the ground on the science, and that was this agenda item.
Good. Any staff updates for us?
Yeah.
sure like to hear about the meeting, the town center meeting,
Yeah, well,
whatever there is to be told.
you might get more detail out of Beth if she were here, because I don't go to all of these initial startup meetings, so if you have a question, I might not be able to answer it. But basically, the town board, as you may know, worked through and signed a development agreement with a developer for the town center. This developer is in the process of purchasing the Biela and Mankick properties and is in negotiations, I understand, with Spicer and at least the Shuck properties, which are the other 80 acres, those two pieces to the south
The red.
of the town center of Biela and Mankick. So that is, the idea there is they're putting together a 180-acre parcel. And then there's a couple of things that I think that they feel they need to do. One is they might need to modify the PD that has been approved for the BL Mankick property to accommodate certain changes that probably need to be made. And then the other issue is they need to rezone, assuming they acquire Spicer and Shuck, for example, they have to want to rezone that to planned development. So the issue is getting these development requests processed. And we're right now in the situation where we're trying to figure out what they really need to have. They need to have at least, I guess, rezoning in order to deal with the financial aspect of the project to get it started. So all I'm saying is there's a possibility that we may need to have a hearing in front of the planning commission as early as April 16th, but probably more likely around the April 23rd. And then there may be more work after that. It depends on how we sort this process out, which we will be having a meeting in a little bit more detail with the developer on Thursday. But the one thing that's definitely there is some pressure to try to get the property rezoned before the middle of May so they can meet some financing obligations. And that means also a closure on the property. So we're trying to figure that all out. But it could be that we have at least a hearing on the 23rd of April, is the way it's currently scheduled. And this is actually a big move. We went through that process last summer. I think it's a little surprising, maybe to me anyway, that a developer was beginning to step to the plate faster than I thought. So the effort that the town made in terms of rezoning the property did, I think, bear some fruit. And hopefully these people have the ability to follow through. So anyway, that's the main thing that's coming up. That there may be a hearing on the 23rd, And then the question is, if planning commission needs more time, the other options were to have a second meeting if that's needed, on either April 25th, which is a Thursday, or the 29th, it was told, was given to me as another option, which I believe is a Monday. Yeah, so, anyway, that's sort of what's percolating here below the surface, and that's about all that I am aware of now.
Couple questions. It was within the last year or two, we had discussions about getting our hands on some even preliminary agendas sooner than the Thursday or Friday before a Tuesday meeting. Is that, I don't remember what the result of that discussion was, and whether there would be an opportunity to either get draft or preliminary information a little bit sooner than 4 or 5 days. I'm sure the town board would love that too, or what the legal implications of that are, just to help us prepare a little bit better. Wherever that's at, I'm still in favor of having a little more time if it's possible. I don't know if that was a question, probably more of a statement.
Well, I join in it because, the stakes are getting exponentially higher, and, some more time to
Well, some of
digest
these are
things.
huge packages.
Well, it might help us move a little bit faster. I mean, because
Well, that as well.
I really am uncomfortable when I watch the planning commission or the board sit there and clearly not understand something. And I've seen it time and time again. I've seen it in this commission, and I've seen it on the board and heads just get nodded and votes get, and you're looking at it going, clearly there are pieces that are not understood, right? And so I will take a stand if I don't, and I've done it, and I'll do it as I move forward. If I don't understand something, I just won't vote on it, or I'll say no because I don't know better, and that's just going to slow a process down. And so anything we can do to improve that, I think, would be awesome.
Yeah, well, I'll bring that up again, and I'll bring that up with the rest of the staff, because I realize it's an issue.
And my second question was, there's an annexation agreement in place. I don't know what's changed, if it ever changed, if it's still what it was 10 years ago regarding Spicer Car.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's the same.
So there's still a 60% open space requirement on that property?
Yes.
Okay.
It's still there. I mean, nothing, it still exists. It will be part of the mix, the annexation agreement for both Spicer and, well, at that time it was Carlson.
Okay.
Carlson
Yeah.
still sold it to Shuck.
Okay, yeah, yep.
And, yes, that's still there.
Okay,
And from my understanding, the developers are aware of those stipulations in the annexation, both of those annexation agreements. Actually, for both properties, it's kind of a combined annexation agreement.
and is there a mechanism by which that could be requested to be altered or changed?
Well, I suspect so. I've never gone through an annexation agreement amendment, to be quite frank. It would have to be mutually agreed upon, any changes to that between the property owners
And the town, right? So would that require a public,
Right? I mean,
I would need to look into,
and would that require a public process? That's my biggest
Well, it
concern.
would require a public process, that's
Yeah.
pretty sure. We
Okay.
want to do that anyway.
Okay.
Because there are people in town, like yourself, who know about these things and
And why
they
it was done,
exist.
yeah.
And also folks that live, south of the border there in Rock Creek, so.
Yeah.
So it's pretty obvious that the annexation agreements are there, and they'll have to be dealt with in terms of the planning for those properties. That has to be incorporated into it unless everybody decides that maybe idea should change here in this way, and then there would have to be a mutual agreement on that. That's my.
yeah, I would need to review the requirements for amending an annexation agreement. I couldn't give you an answer right now.
That's fine. Okay.
But there would be a public process.
Yeah.
Wanted to bring it up at a public forum too, so, okay. Anything else?
Yeah, and I think on that, as soon as there's a schedule that's figured out that we can accommodate to deal with this thing, I think what Beth ought to do is send it out to y'all. you have at least advance warning that this is the day, that we're gonna, and these are some alternatives for a second meeting in case we need it. Right now, it's targeted the 23rd, so. And that's all I have, Clint.
Okay, there had been a item on the agenda in the past, Chase Bank
Yes.
drive-in ATM or something. Did that go away?
Well, from my perspective, it's temporarily gone away. I think the developer, Chase Bank, from what I was talking to Beth, it seems like they might have changed the design group that was working on this thing. So we haven't heard back from them, and she's queried them a couple of times about whether they want to get their stuff in because there's a meeting in May or something like that. There's really not a lot of response. But that doesn't mean that it's not, going to come back. After all, it's not a big deal. It's an ATM out in the middle of a parking lot, so I don't think they're under a big rush to get it done. So I don't understand what's going on with them. It's just that we haven't heard from them for a little bit of time. But as far as I'm concerned, it's still an open case. And we haven't gotten anything from us that we're abandoning this idea, so.
Okay.
Is there anything else like that that was dangling in your mind?
Good. Anybody have anything else? Okay. Adjourned.
So the 23rd is not available.
Correct. Let me look at it real quick. I want to say.
The next one?